Psalm 23 is written by a man who perhaps experienced less peace on this earth than any person you've ever known. No one in this room has had a more tumultuous life than King David. And yet he has this portrait of who God is as his shepherd that I can't help but think is something that was his personal gift from God. You may be seated. Thank you to Jay and the family ski for leading worship the last 2 weeks. I'm grateful for that. Did an excellent job. Congregation did an excellent job singing. Boy, it's good to have people back in second service. Can I be honest with you for just a little bit? First service was kicking y'all's butts for the last couple of months now, and so it's good to have second service strong. It's good. We're in another week of This Is My Story as we go chronologically from creation all the way to and through the cross into the story of the church here today. We're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel today. If you're here today and need a Bible, we ask that you raise your hand and Usher can get one to you. If you don't own a Bible, feel free to take this one home as a gift from us to you. As we were concluding the story of Ruth last week, we saw that Ruth and Boaz had a son whose name was Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse. We're going to hear him mentioned later on today. Jesse had a son named David, who would eventually become the king of Israel. So our job today is to start bridging the gap of what happened between Ruth and to David as the line of God's promise continues to extend forward from this time. So we are in the book of 1 Samuel. Well, who is Samuel? Samuel is regarded as the last judge of Israel. If you remember, the book of Ruth takes place in the context of the book of Judges. And now the last judge of Israel was regarded to be this man named Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 27 through 28, we see a story that we use repeatedly inside of our church services during parent-child dedication services. The book of Samuel opens with a lady who is unable to conceive a child in the house of the Lord, begging God to give her a child. And she made a promise to God, as many desperate people do, that if you will, I will. And she said, if you give me a child, I will dedicate him to your service all the days of his life. And so sure enough, she comes back a year later, and she has been given this child. And she weans the child, and she gets him through the diaper phase and the bottle phase and the car seat phase. I don't know how many phases there were back in those days, but she brings Samuel to the Lord and presents him into the temple. She made a commitment. She was going to fulfill that commitment. And so Samuel was dedicated to the service of the Lord. There he grew up under the authority of the high priest at that time. And Samuel was used from an early age as a prophet and as a judge. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 27 through 28, Hannah, his mother, says that the Lord has heard my prayers and I have committed him all the days of his life. He will be committed to the service of the Lord. And so we say that when we have parent-child dedication here, the understanding that children are gifts to us, but they're not ours. They're his and our custody. And it's our job to prepare them for what God has in store. Samuel was an excellent leader, a great judge over Israel, and the people experienced great blessing and prosperity under his leadership. However, as a wicked people who are progressively growing away from the things of God, the people rise up and they say, look, Samuel, you're a good leader, but you're a bad dad. Your sons aren't following in your footsteps, which is a common problem in the Old Testament times. We don't want to be to follow your sons. We want to be like every other nation in the world, which broke God's heart. God looks at Samuel and says, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. And I believe that God says this because he had called Israel to be a unique nation. Through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, through Joseph, through the sons, through Moses, through the law, through the giving of the promised land, God had called them to be a very distinct people among all the peoples on the face of the earth. And now God's chosen elect people say, we want to be just like everybody else. And it's like forfeiting the birthright that God had given to them. And so God's heart is grieved, but God gives them the request. Now God had a long time planned for there eventually to be a monarchy over his people. We know this because Jacob, or Israel, as he's blessing his children before he passes at the end of the book of Genesis, looks at Judah and says, out of you will come a scepter who will rule over your people. There's a concept that there will be a ruler at some point in time. It's just that that the people were asking for something that wasn't in God's specific timetable. But God acquiesced to them, and he allowed them to have a man. And God points out to Samuel a man named Saul. Saul was chosen by God to be the first king, and he was a remarkable man for a lot of reasons. First of all, he was chosen from the smallest of the tribes of Israel. The smallest, most insignificant family, kind of tucked away geographically in the middle of nowhere. His primary qualification was that he was a head taller than everybody else, which probably means he was about 5'8", if you get my drift, right? It's not like the Israeli national basketball team is winning world championships, if you get my drift. So he was a taller guy, but he wasn't really a big guy. But Saul was chosen by God. And what a remarkable story that you can go home and read yourselves in these early chapters of chapters 8 and 9. And then God eventually has Samuel bring Saul to the people of Israel in chapter 10 and has him anointed as king over all Israel. And it's in this moment that Israel moves from being a theocracy to becoming a monarchy, just like every other nation. And Saul was a reluctant leader. When he was coronated, he was found hiding amongst the bags and the boxes. He did not want the job, but he was brought up to the forefront, and God used him. When he walked in humility and by the power of God, he was used in a powerful way. But then Saul was not just a head taller, but he got a fat head because of the success that God had given to him. The story of Saul is a cautionary tale for many people who are willing but not equipped to jump into a job. Saul was not capable of handling the responsibility, spiritually speaking, from a maturity standpoint. He had all the physical tools to make that happen. He had the Spirit of God to make it happen. But he saw God's success in him and through him as his personal success, and he started becoming loose with God's purposes and commands. One of the things in 1 Samuel chapter 15 that God asked King Saul to do is to go and to bring justice upon the Amalekites. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. God says, I specifically want you to go out and utterly destroy the Amalekites. Now, that doesn't seem like a loving thing to do. But if we go back into the book of Exodus, chapter 17, you will find that Israel has now just crossed the Red Sea. They're vulnerable. They're not a military people. They don't have food. They don't have water. And this Amalekite group of people decide to come out and attack Israel at that time. And so Moses trusts Joshua to go and fight a battle they were not prepared for on territory they were unfamiliar with. And Moses, being at an advanced age, decides he can't go out there and actually swing the sword anymore. So he goes to the top of the hill with his staff. And as his staff is raised, as his hands are raised, the people of Israel are winning. But when his hands drop, they're losing. And it has nothing to do with Moses' hands. It has everything to do with this concept of God's strength at work on behalf of his people. So we have the story of Aaron and Hur coming alongside and holding Moses' arms up, and Israel wins a powerful victory at that time. The Amalekites were trying to take advantage of the Israelites in that season. And so God says that I'm going to bring justice upon them. They were a wicked people then. They continue for generations to be a wicked people. And with all of that in mind, there was a real problem that was transpiring here. So God says, I need them to be gone. And this is an occasion where the people begin to get frustrated with the Old Testament version of God. Because God says, I want them totally devoted. I want the men, I want the women, I want the children, I want the houses, I want the livestock, I want everything gone. Because that's how God deals with sin. Sin is an enemy of God. And God doesn't make provision or quarter for that. They were opposed to the things of God, to the will of God. That's what sin is. And God says it goes, and you're like, well, wait a minute, what about the innocents? There are no innocents when it comes to sin. And God is setting a precedent for how he handles justice and how he handles his wrath. And God is not just justice and wrath, but he is also justice and wrath. And we live in a society where we try to put the syrup of grace all over everything and just say, you know what, but God's God love and grace, and that's the God I want to worship. And he is indeed that. But we only appreciate the grace of God when it's in contrast to his justice and to his wrath. And we just got finished studying in the book of Ruth and the story of his faithfulness and righteousness and his mercy. given to these people who were in a terrible state. But God moved heaven and earth to put the pieces together to bless them who are faithful to him. And for those who are used in opposition to the things of God, God wanted them to wipe off the face of the earth. Parents, you need to understand this. We did a parenting class last year. And you would have thought that the concept and institution of parenting was invented in 2025. All these new concepts like, oh, wow, well, we just want to be loving and gentle and kind, compassionate. God says that when you start making provision to house bits of sin and don't tolerate or tolerate little things and give room for that, you are setting a horrible precedent for your kids over the holiness of God. If you want your kids walking in a proper respect for the things of God, you have to have a proper respect for the things of God, which means that when sin presents itself, it has to be dealt with and eradicated. Doesn't mean you have to be harsh, you just have to be stern. So delayed obedience is, failure. Delayed obedience is disobedience. And partial obedience is disobedience, right? This is a principle that God is sending Israel to go and to bring justice upon the Amalekites, and this will play out later on. Right? God gave Saul a tremendous victory over the Amalekites. But instead of doing what God asked, Saul decided to take some of the plunder for himself. First of all, he kept the king of the Amalekites, his name was Agag, alive, and kept him to make a spectacle of. This might become a problem later on in the history of Israel when it comes to the book of Esther, when Haman was an Agagite and he had desired to exterminate the Jewish people. Can't prove that link, but that name presents itself later on, right? You find then that he also keeps the spoils of the goods of the people of the Amalekites. And Samuel goes to check in on his king and says, wait a minute, as I'm approaching, what I hear before I ever see the king is I hear the sound of animals. And so what is this? God told you to devote this entirely to him. It needs to go. They need to be put to death. Why are you still keeping animals? And when Samuel confronts Saul, Saul does the sinner shuffle. Do you know what I'm talking about, the sinner shuffle? You're confronted in your sin. And immediately there's certain things that happen. The first thing typically happens is blame shifting. Saul says, it's not my fault. The soldiers really wanted it done that way. And so I didn't want to stand against them. It was a great victory, and so I just let them do it. Well, that was not true. He was lying, but he tried to put the blame on his soldiers. That's what a great leader does, right? Blames the soldiers. Samuel challenges him on that. And then he begins to justify it. Oh, well, you said God wants it devoted to him. And so what I did is I took the best of things, and I'm going to sacrifice it to God later. That's what I'm going to do. I just haven't done it yet. Delayed obedience, right, is disobedience. And then he finally confesses to Samuel after he's pressed even further. He says, I've sinned in the eyes of God. And in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 22 through 23, Samuel replied, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as just an obedience to him? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination or witchcraft, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. The Bible says that as Samuel walks away, that Saul grabs his cloak and Samuel's garment tears. And in this way, Samuel says to Saul that God has torn the kingdom out of your hands and is giving it to a better man. Now, not only is it a pretty good Pearl Jam song, but the idea now exists in Saul's mind that the kingdom is going to be handed to someone else, and he doesn't know who that person is. And so now Saul begins to panic and wondering what's going to happen next as things happen inside of his kingdom. He's looking over his shoulder. Now, there's an interesting dynamic that happens between Saul and Samuel. Saul is pretty much one of the worst leaders you can possibly imagine. As Samuel grieves over his failures, he so desperately wants Saul to succeed. And so he finds himself in a time of mourning. And in chapter 16, God looks at him and says, are you done crying yet? There's a nation to run. I've got the better man picked out. You need to go to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, and go and anoint one of his sons to become king. And so we find in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 6 through 7, that Samuel obeys. And if you'll stand with me in honor of God's holy word, we're going to read these verses together. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 6 through 7. The Bible says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And for all of you who are less than a perfect 10 in this room, you need to highlight that verse as your theme verse in life, right? Lord, we're grateful to you that you take people who are less than perfect. And I'm grateful that you know our hearts. And Lord, I'm grateful that you've also made each one of us in your image for a specific purpose, for a time. Lord, as we consider your goodness to keep your covenant plans moving forward through less than perfect vessels who are seeking to honor you, Lord, I pray that we would see ourselves in this role here today, that we would see our story being told in the pages of the Old Testament today, and that you draw us closer to yourself as we consider carefully the privilege it is to follow in your footsteps. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. External appearances are what got Israel excited about Saul. He was a head taller than everybody else. Surely he must be the most qualified of kings. Samuel then goes and starts looking for a pattern of what God is looking for in the kings. And he sees what we presume to be the oldest son of Jesse, Eliab, standing there. And God says, I've not chosen this one. I've rejected this one as king, specifically. Don't look on the outward appearances, Samuel. God looks at the heart. And I feel like there's so many times where we miss out on this because we're a society that's very visually driven. We're easily deceived by appearances of what we see. You don't have to look any further than social media and how it drives the affections and passions of people these days, that there's a facade put on the front, but behind is something deeply broken. Most of the time, we're unable to value what God values and see in the life of someone else what God values because we don't value it ourselves. I will tell you that this passage has been used a couple of times in my life very specifically. The first was, as a young person, I was in a tradition of faith that looked toward holiness as a symbol. And at times, it became very much about me and not about God. This is all the things I do. And so I met a man at one point who was in a collection of friends who came in and looked literally like Cousin It from whatever that show was, the Munsters or whatever it was, just hair all over, just hair everywhere. I didn't know if it was a man or a woman. But it could play guitar like you would not believe, right? And when it spoke, it was a testimony of tremendous grace that God had worked inside of his heart. And his name was Brian. And Brian had hair everywhere, and Brian had tattoos everywhere. And from where I grew up, those are all the things that indicate that you are far from the things of God. And so I meet this guy, and what I hear coming out of his mouth, although I'd already judged him as being someone who couldn't possibly love Jesus, what comes out of his mouth, the overflow of his heart, is speaking praise for the victory that God had won in his life over the things of his past. And what had happened in his heart just hadn't grown out through his head yet, right? That was the only difference. Not that God needs clean-shaven people in order to love Jesus, right? But there was a story that was being told. And I remember in that moment that God brought this passage to my mind, even as a teenager, that God doesn't look at the outward appearance, God looks at the heart. Now, we have to understand in a culture that's visually driven, that when we choose to put obstacles in people's ways, it makes a barrier to the gospel, right? So what we present, how are we shrouding the gospel? And what is that message? Is it a secret prize hidden inside, or is it something that's projecting? So how we present ourselves makes a difference. But I remember that very clearly. And as I look at Ben Sutherland sitting here, I remember back in the day when we were looking for new leaders for Street Meet. And Ben and Crystal come to us back here in the office and saying, we feel like that God's calling us to lead Street Meet. I was like, I'm not so sure about that. Because they were fairly new to our church. They didn't have an extensive resume of leadership capacity. This is a critical ministry that takes a great deal of resources and time. It's one of the harder ones to administrate because it's off campus, and the communication gap is huge. The age range is very difficult. I'm looking for all of this list of things that would say you're the right person to lead this task. And so we're like, we'll get back with you guys as we pursue other options. And systematically, these other options aren't working. And I believe God brought this to my mind again, saying, don't look for a resume. Don't look for what they've done in the past. Look for what I'm asking them to do with the calling I've placed on their lives. They came to you and said, we believe God's asking us to do this. And so I went to the elders, like, I think we need to give Ben and Crystal a chance. And I'm so glad we did, because God's called you to do it. And if we'd only had 2 more people to come alongside and help them, we'd be in great shape, right? How do you like that? Just a little plug there for you, bud. And you've done an excellent, excellent job. And so I'm grateful for how that's worked, yes. We judge by outside appearances all the time. And we miss what God is doing and what God is stirring, right? So in 1 Samuel 16, verse 10, Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons that you have? Well, they're still the youngest. There's always the youngest, right? The forgotten one, the one who got left at Walmart, right? Or whatever it is, like, it's still in the cart, right? There's always the youngest. And he's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him and brought him in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. How ironic. And this conversation that God doesn't look at the outward appearance. What is Samuel recording about David? His outward appearance. But Samuel is a little slow too. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. What we see in the midst of this is that David was not present because he wasn't even considered eligible. What we know of him is that he's the youngest son of David or Jesse. He's a good-looking kid, and he was a shepherd. The shepherd was considered to be one of the least honorable roles in society. Almost certainly every one of his brothers had that job until the next one came up, just like taking out the trash in our house. Every kid had it until the youngest one came up. And now I got to take the trash out again. The candle's gone. What happened? Circle of life. Anyway, there's this challenge now that David he's just tending the sheep. That's all he is. He's the youngest. He takes care of the sheep. It was a job for the infirmed or the disabled. It wasn't an overly complicated task. Why would God choose him? But what we find is that God is uniquely and specifically calling David to a very specific task. What better person to learn to lead people who have wandered astray from the things of God during the period of Judges into a relationship that's close to God than a man who's acquainted with leading and loving those who tend to be wayward? It's remarkable the number of times that Jesus himself portrays himself as the good shepherd, as he says in the Gospel of John, and how he longs to have people brought in. It's no wonder that when the message of Jesus' birth and the fulfillment of the messianic promise comes out, that one of the first people that know it are the shepherds. God has a heart for the shepherds. And that's why the great privilege of leading a church is given to pastors whose role is considered to be a shepherd of his people. This is a remarkable position to be in. And God would teach this future warrior king the lessons necessary to lead well by being a shepherd. Now, we know a lot about the life of David in hindsight. Now, David has no idea what his future is going to be, but we know that someday soon he will be the man who goes to fight Goliath. He'll be the one who'll become a wildly successful military genius. Eventually, Saul is going to realize that he's the better man, and he's going to go and try to hunt David down. He'll live in exile for many years. David will eventually become king after fleeing Saul for many decades. He'll have a desire to build the things of God and build a temple, a permanent house for God, but God's going to tell him no. At some point, he's going to sink away from God and fall into adultery and eventually murder, be pursued and hounded by his own son for the throne. It's going to be a difficult season for his life. But the shepherd king was given a gift from God. And that gift is something that we see in the scriptures as well. David had a close personal relationship with God. He feared God first and led God's people second. And most of the experience that we have with David is very unique in the scriptures, almost unlike anyone else. Not only do we get the narrative of his life, but then we have in David's own words in the book of Psalms, the battles that he faces, the peaks and valleys, the strengths and weaknesses, the times when he's celebrating and the time when he's horribly depressed. And we watch how God works at him through all of this. And in the midst of all of those Psalms, we find one that stands out as a particular gift, I believe, to David, and that is Psalm 23. We don't know when this psalm was written in the chronology of David's life, but I happen to believe, and you don't have to say this or believe this, but I happen to believe that Psalm 23 was a specific gift that God gave to David as an opportunity to view God in a way that no one else could. I believe that God gave this to him as a gift, and I'm not saying it's some kind of a Joseph Smith Book of Mormon nonsense kind of revelation. What I'm saying is it's as David is considering God from where he is through the lens of his experience, that he sees God in a unique way, but in a way that resonates with all of us, which is why Psalm 23 is such a powerful passage that most people memorize. It resonates with us because we find ourselves at some point in time walking through a same season of life that David is. And I believe that this psalm is somewhat prophetic, because as we're going to look at the life of David for the next couple of weeks, we're going to see that God is weaving into his heart the goodness of God, even as he's prepared to walk through tumultuous seasons of life. It's interesting when we do funeral services, memorial services, that people want to have Psalm 23 read at the service because they love the idea of the Lord as my shepherd. But Psalm 23 is written by a man who perhaps experienced less peace on this earth than any person you've ever known. No one in this room has had a more tumultuous life than King David. And yet he has this portrait of who God is as his shepherd that I can't help but think is something that was his personal gift from God. That when he's running from Saul, he remembers Psalm 23. When he's going out to face Goliath, he is recounting the words of the goodness of his God. When he's being chased down by his son, when he's being confronted by Nathan, the words that God gives to him of this picture of God as his shepherd resonates in his heart and brings him peace. Why? Because despite the tumult of his life, he has a perspective of what the Prince of Peace is. It's perhaps one of the clearest proofs of the concept that true peace is not a function of your circumstances. True peace is found at the priority and position of God in your life as you walk through those circumstances. Let me tell you what I'm talking about here. There are seasons in life where you're going through a hard time and you say, I need to change something about my circumstances so I can have peace. I'll change my marriage relationship. I'll change my job. I'll change my town. I'll change my church. I'll do whatever it takes so I can find peace. I'm going to change the circumstances because the circumstances aren't bringing me peace. And Psalm 23 doesn't say that. What Psalm 23 says is you need to have a proper priority and position of God in your life as you walk through the circumstances. And if God's in his right place, then you can have peace no matter where you are. That's what Psalm 23 says. Now, I know a lot of you are already like, oh, I love Psalm 23. I studied that, like 25 times over the course of my life, and I can memorize it, and I got the badge for a while. Stop right now. We're not doing any of that, all right? I want you to listen to Psalm 23 through the eyes of a man who is prepared to go through hardship and cling to the goodness of God, all right? That's how we're going to listen to Psalm 23 here today. Kids, if you're still awake and want to come down and join me, I could use your help here today. Kids, come on down here. All ages, come on down. Even our recent 6th graders. You're going to be my little sheep. Can you guys be my little sheep here today? Hey, how you doing? How you doing? Okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. I need to hear your best sheep voice. Can I hear your best sheep voice? That's actually quite convincing. Very good. I'm a city boy. I wouldn't know. So let's go over here, over to the side. We're going to go to our little sheep pen over here as we go through Psalm 23. All right? Psalm 23. And for those who are willing to help me out with this, I got some candy for you after the service. Come on over here, guys. I want you to hang out over here. This is your little sheep pen for now, okay? Come on over here. I'm not going to ask you to do anything dangerous or life-threatening or embarrassing. I just need you to hang out over here. And the Bible says in Psalm 23, verses 1, "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Go ahead, just take a snooze, right? These are your green pastures. Just lie down in green pastures, right? He leads me beside the quiet waters. Can you hear the panpipes in the background? Yes, peace, right? He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. There's so many layers to this, but one of the things that we believe and trust that when God is our shepherd, that he leads us to good places. And it's easy to trust God as our shepherd when we're going to the mountaintops, right? We say this every Sunday. There's people who walk in and they're on the mountaintop, and some are walking through the valley. Psalm 23. We trust the good shepherd when we're in the green pastures and when we're beside the quiet waters and when we're refreshed. But let me explain something to you. What God makes clear here is that peace does not come from full stomachs and satisfied thirst. Sometimes we believe that naturally speaking, that if our thirst is quenched and if our stomachs are full and we have contentment physically, then God is truly blessing us. But what he says here is that he refreshes my soul. When God is leading us in paths of righteousness, when he is our shepherd, he is not necessarily looking out for your physical condition, but he's looking out for your spiritual condition. The satisfaction is going to be found in the soul. Why do I say this? Because there's many people who are in the decision-making process who will say, if God is my shepherd, then I lack nothing. Therefore, if I lack something materially in my life, then I must not be where God wants me to be. So I'll sacrifice everything to go to a place where I can have material possessions, because clearly that's what God's desire is. And many times families, under the guise of following the good shepherd to a place where there's no lack or no want, will find themselves in a position where their soul will be in great turmoil because they're looking for material possessions. But God says, when I'm leading you to my destination, you can have peace because I'm the priority of your life. And not only will your physical needs be met, but your soul will be satisfied as well. That's the goodness of God, right? He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. I can have confidence that God is guiding because both my body and my soul are satisfied, and I can have confidence that I'm on the right path because he is guiding me. My job is to stay close to him. In Psalm 23, verses 4 through 5, it says, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." It's also reasonable for people to assume that when there's turmoil inside of your life, that somehow you've missed God's best, that God's no longer present, that God's forsaken you. But listen to this passage that's supposed to be the definition of peace read at all the funerals that you can imagine. "Even though I walk through the darkest valley," it's a place I've never been. I don't understand where we're going. I don't understand what we're doing here. I'm confused. There's a problem. And we start to understand now that God is moving us in this reason for a very specific purpose. God says that I will lead you through there, and God may take us through that, and God has not forsaken us there. And even though we're walking through the darkest valley, through the shadow of death, I will fear nothing because God is still with us. Sometimes the good shepherd walks you through a valley as part of his perfect plan. And he's still a good God. He's taking you to the next green pasture, right? It's time to grow up. And sometimes you only see that through a crisis or a problem. God doesn't stop being good because you're in a valley. God's just taking you to another pasture. That's the goodness of God. And what I love in the midst of all of this is it says, "The Lord is my shepherd," not "God is my shepherd." The Lord is my shepherd. Who is the Lord? We're introduced to the Lord in the book of Exodus when God calls Moses to lead Israel out. And while he's standing there at the burning bush and Moses has every objection possible to why he can't do the task that God's asked him to do, then we find then that he says, just Moses, stop. Just tell him the I am is sending you. The I am, the all-sufficient one, the Lord. All places, at all times, all powerful, all competent, all knowing. He has everything in place. What a great shepherd we can trust to go through a valley of indecision, of fear, of concern, of turmoil, than with the good shepherd, who is the Lord, who is the all things. Not only will God take us through valleys as part of his perfect plan, But as he does so, he leads us with his rod and his staff. And there's a lot of supposition as to what this means. There are supposedly two tools that shepherds would use: to correct, to guide, to lead, to protect, to draw near. That's what the shepherd does when we're close to him, that we can experience the effect of his hands in close proximity to him when perhaps our eyes aren't focused on him all the way, that God will still draw us to himself, right? And he's good. His rod and his staff bring comfort and correction when necessary. God may also lead you into conflict with other people. He says, you prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. Sheep are typically the food at the buffet, yes? When they're walking through the valley, everybody wants to eat the sheep. But God says when you're walking through the valley and there's people around who want to devour your life, conflict isn't necessarily the worst thing. In fact, God will honor you in the midst of conflict by making you the guest of honor. Although everyone is looking at you as food, he's going to be the one that sets up and makes sure that you're feasting, that you're blessed, that your head is anointed with oil, that your cup is overflowing. You are the honored guest in a party that's dedicated to devouring your life. That's what God does. And you only see that when you're surrounded by your enemies. God, in his goodness, will walk you as part of his perfect plan through seasons of conflict when necessary to help you to see how he sets you apart from the rest of his people. God may lead you in this regard. Now, what you notice is, kids, come on, let's get a little bit over here, right? I mean, you don't have to. You can stay where you are if you want, but just, you can come here. Because I'm moving on, right? Just stay where you are. You're the only one, Abe. You're my favorite. Go ahead, have a seat. All right? Make a good sheep noise. Okay, that's good enough. Just plop down where you are. Now notice these kids were already checked out, much like their moms and dads are right now too. It's funny, you tell them to stop acting like an animal because they act like an animal at Walmart, and then you act like an animal at church, and suddenly they're just totally immersed in what's going on. It's reverse psychology, people. Now, here comes the last part, all right? We're doing total injustice to Psalm 23. But this last part is surely goodness and mercy, or surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We know that those who are close to the shepherd can experience the compassion, the love, the correction, the discipline, guidance necessary from God's rod and his staff. But over time, there are seasons in life where you're distracted, you're distant, you're picking your nose, you're looking out the window at the playground equipment, there's things going on around. You're not distant from God because you're walking in abject rebellion. You just got distracted by the cool things that are all around in the process from A to B. I mean, that's what happened with David a couple of times in his life. And he says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. One of the great joys in my life was when I lived in Ireland for about a year and a half. My dad chose to put us on a sheep farm with John and Geraldine Kenny. And if you can just close your eyes and picture what a sheep farm looks like in Ireland, it's every bit as awesome as what you're thinking about times 5. It was just stunning. And I watched as the shepherd had a big job in front of him. But the shepherd had a very specific tool to help him accomplish and manage his tasks. And so I got a little video here for you I want you to show of the concept of goodness and mercy. Look at those dogs going to work up there, right? And notice where the sheep are. The sheep are not at the front of the pack. They're the ones who are distracted, away from the front of the pile, off of the fringes, settling for something less than what the best is that the shepherd wants to lead them to. And those dogs will work all day long at the direction of the shepherd to push the sheep to the good place that he intends. And they will spend hours doing this. And we got to watch this all day long. Goodness and mercy following him all the days of his life. And so we can keep going for this video, but I know the parents won't be paying attention much more anymore either. Sometimes you wonder what the goodness of God is doing and if God is even moving. But these kids here need to be encouraged to draw close to the shepherd. And so we're going to introduce you to goodness and mercy over here. I choose Joel as mercy and Joey as goodness, but they're going to hustle our kids over this way, right? Come on. Right? Shepherd doesn't move. Right? Shepherd doesn't move. God sends goodness and mercy after them all the days of their life, bringing them close into connection with the shepherd once again. You guys can have a seat, because this is where we're going to camp out for a little while. All right? Now the rod and the staff can comfort them, guide them, direct them. Thank you, goodness and mercy. Here's the thing that I think is very important for us to understand. There's times where you feel distant from God and wondering if God even notices or if God can even still love us. But even when we stray away, we're not left behind. God makes provision through goodness and mercy to bring us close to himself. Now, God's love might look different, right? The measure of God's love doesn't change based upon our proximity. The method of his love does. God still loves us, but he shows his love not with the rod and staff, but with goodness and mercy. It looks different. Sometimes it looks threatening. Sometimes it looks imposing. You get that diagnosis, you get that bad news, something's happening to somebody, and it suddenly rings your bell. Wait a minute, where's God? Oh, I need to stop just dorking around here. I got to draw close to God. And that's an act of God's love. His goodness never ceases. His mercy is new every morning. When we stray away from the shepherd, the two things we rely upon more than anything else are his goodness and his mercy, which gives us opportunities to be drawn back into the fold and close to the shepherd. That's the goodness of God. It's not always benevolent and hugging and loving. Sometimes God sends the dogs. The dogs are specifically tasked to help the shepherd to bring them in. And so as we close out our service today, kids, you did an excellent job. I'm going to have you go back to your moms and dads, your guardians, grandparents. I got candy for you afterward. I just think it's important now as we go through the life of David that we keep in mind this Psalm 23 passage, because I believe it's something that God gave him to help him negotiate every phase of his life. When he stands in the presence of his enemy, Goliath, next week, Psalm 23 is going to resonate inside of his mind. I believe it. Can't prove it, but I believe it. Have the worship team come on stage now as we close out our service. This psalm is important for you as well. God's walking some of you through your valleys. He's walking some of you through your enemies. Sometimes he's walking you through a place of peace. Sometimes you're distant from him, and he sends his goodness and mercy to draw you to himself. But he is a loving God, and he is a good shepherd. And he doesn't stop being good just because you don't understand where you're going. That's what we celebrate with our God. We're going to close here today with a song and do something a little bit unusual. There's a version of this psalm, and the psalms are songs. And I believe that these are the songs that David was just singing in his head. Years ago, I came across this. A lot of you guys will know Shane and Shane, they're a Christian band. They sing amazing songs. And they put Psalm 23 to a song. And in my mind, as I hear this is exactly what I picture a shepherd in a field being prepared by God for a remarkable task would be singing as God's embedding it into his soul, preparing for the difficult task of being his steward over his people in the days ahead. So as the song is being sung by the people on stage, if you know it, you're welcome to sing with us. But I just want you to hear something that I believe is so much, very much like what David would have been singing to himself as he was negotiating the trials of life. Band.